The freighter Halcyon Vow drifted dark against the amber haze of the Kessid expanse, her running lights dead, her distress beacons strangled mid-transmission. 41 civilians lay zip-bound along her cargo deck, kneeling in 2 neat rows under the muzzles of Ashari compact raiders, while outside her hull, less than 800 meters off her portside airlock, the United Colonial Warship UCS Reckoning held position with her weapons cold and her boarding tubes retracted. That was the part the raiders would remember, not the boarding, not the hostages, the 800 meters and the fact that the Reckoning had not fired. Commander Ithrain Voss of the Ashari Compact stood in the freighter's command well with his boot resting on the neck of a woman who had made the mistake of screaming when his men breached the bridge. He keyed the comm to the human warship's frequency and let his voice carry the practiced boredom of a man who had done this 100 times across 40 systems, to 40 crews who had all, eventually, done exactly what he told them to do. Human vessel. This is Commander Voss of the Compact. You will stand down your weapons and open a corridor for my shuttle, or I will begin executing your citizens in intervals of 90 seconds. I have done this before. I am telling you now so there is no confusion later about whether I meant it. There was a pause. Static hissed. Then a second voice answered. Flat, unhurried, almost gentle, the voice of someone reading a weather report. This is Captain Elena Reyes, Commanding Officer UCS Reckoning. I heard you. I want to make sure you heard me too, so I'm only going to say this once. You have 30 seconds to walk off that ship. After that, I stop listening. Voss laughed, and half his boarding crew laughed with him, the way men laugh when they have already decided how a thing ends. He had read the intelligence briefings. Humanity was young to the stars, sentimental, slow to violence, prone to negotiating, prone to mercy. The Compact had profited from that softness for 6 years, skimming convoys along the frontier where human patrols were thin and human diplomats were thick. 30 seconds, Voss repeated, savoring it, and pressed his sidearm to the kneeling woman's skull. Let's see what a Deathworlder does with 30 seconds. He got his answer at second 4. The Reckoning did not fire a warning shot. She did not hail again. Her point defense turrets, which Voss's sensors had logged as dormant, rotated in a motion too fast for his threat board to register as anything but static, and every external light on the raider vessel docked to the Halcyon Vow's spine went dark in the same half-second. Not destroyed, severed, the raider ship's main power trunk opened by a railgun round fired with a precision that had nothing to do with luck and everything to do with a targeting solution built hours before Voss ever opened a comm channel. In the sudden dark, 41 hostages heard boots on the hull above them. Not compact boots. Voss's radio crackled with a new voice, close, breathing steady, speaking a language his translator rendered a half-second late because the words came too fast, too calm, too certain. Commander Voss, my name is Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chen, United Colonial Marine Corps 2nd Boarding Company. You've got about 11 seconds left of that 30 you promised the captain. I'd use them to put the gun down. Voss spun toward the airlock. It was already open. It had been open for 6 seconds. He never got to 10. What happened next? What happened over the following 4 days across the Kessid expanse and then across the whole width of the Ashari Compact's territory, and then across every trade lane and pirate frequency and diplomatic cable in that quadrant of the galaxy, became the reason an entire species of raiders stopped boarding human ships. Not because they were ordered to, because the ones who tried it stopped existing to give the order to anyone else. This is the story of how they learned. 3 days earlier, the UCS Reckoning had been doing the least glamorous job in the fleet, escorting a slow civilian convoy of 6 freighters through a stretch of contested trade space that no serious naval power wanted and no serious naval power could quite ignore. The Kessid expanse sat at the seam between 3 governments' claimed borders and none of their patrol schedules, which made it perfect for smugglers, refugees, and, increasingly over the last 18 months, the raiders of the Ashari Compact. Captain Elena Reyes had run escort duty for 11 years before she'd earned her own command, and she'd learned the truth that every convoy officer eventually learns. The raiders never came for the warship. They came for what the warship was guarding, and they came with a plan built entirely around one assumption, that the warship's crew, when threatened directly, would freeze. It wasn't a stupid assumption. It had worked on other species. The Threal Assembly had a doctrine of proportional response so rigid that raiders could time their kill windows around it like clockwork. The Corvain Directorate negotiated first and always, a policy that had cost them 9 convoys and counting. Humanity, still less than a century into interstellar contact, still carried a reputation in the wider galaxy as something between a curiosity and a liability. A species that had shown up talking about diplomacy and trade agreements and multilateral councils, dragging Earth-style bureaucracy across the stars like a security blanket. What the wider galaxy had not yet learned, what the Compact was about to learn in the worst possible classroom, was that humanity's diplomats and humanity's warship crews were not drawn from the same well. The diplomats built the peace. The crews had been selected, trained, and in more cases than any recruiting poster would admit, chosen for exactly the opposite temperament. Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chen had been assigned to the Reckoning 8 months earlier, transferred in after 2 tours putting down slaver operations along the perimeter, the lawless human-adjacent space where corporate raiders and freed criminal fleets preyed on refugee convoys before the colonial navy had the numbers to patrol it properly. Chen didn't talk about the perimeter much. What his file said, and what the rest of Second Boarding Company had pieced together from the 2 times he did talk about it, was that Chen had watched exactly one hostage situation go wrong in his career, on his first deployment, when he was 22 and still following someone else's rules of engagement. He had never let anyone talk him into someone else's rules of engagement again. The convoy had entered the Kesset Expanse at 0600 ship time, running the standard formation. Freighters in a loose diamond, the Reckoning trailing a half-kilometer back where her sensor suite had the clearest field, and her weapons had the widest arc. Chen's Marines were split across 2 of the freighters as embedded security, a standard precaution that had, until this run, never once been necessary. The Compact Raiders came out of a sensor-dead pocket 11 hours in, 3 corvettes and a heavier command ship, dropping out of a debris field that Reyes's tactical officer had flagged as suspicious and been overruled on, because flagging every debris field in the Expanse as suspicious would have added 6 hours to a run that was already running behind schedule. It was, Reyes would say later, the last time she ever let a schedule override her tactical officer's gut. The Raiders hit the Halcyon Vow first, the slowest freighter, trailing at the Diamond's rear corner, carrying medical supplies and 41 civilian passengers who'd paid for transit rather than cargo space. It was a clean cut, a corvette peeling off from the formation's blind spot and grappling the freighter's dorsal hull, before the Reckoning's point defense could get a firing solution without risking the hostages inside. That was the trap, and it was a good one. Voss had run this play before. Grapple the softest ship, take hostages fast, and dare the warship to fire into its own civilians. Every species he'd tried it on had bought the dare. What Voss did not know, what his intelligence had missed because his intelligence was 6 months stale and had been compiled from a species that treated its own military doctrine as a state secret, was that the Reckoning had run this exact scenario in simulation 43 times in the preceding year, against exactly this kind of threat, because Elena Reyes did not believe in convoys without contingencies, and Marcus Chen did not believe in contingencies that required permission from Compact Fleet Command's timetable. The moment the corvette grappled the Halcyon Vow, 2 things happened in near-perfect simultaneity, 400 meters apart, neither one visible to the raiders until it was already too late to matter. First, Captain Reyes ordered the Reckoning's main drive dark and her weapons to passive tracking only, a move that looked, from Voss's sensor suite, exactly like paralysis. It was not paralysis. It was a targeting solution being built in absolute silence. Every raider vessel's power core, hull seam, and drive signature logged and cross-referenced by a tactical computer that had nothing else to do while its captain talked. Second, Gunnery Sergeant Chen and 4 Marines already embedded aboard the Halcyon Vow, invisible to Voss's boarding party because they'd been folded into the passenger manifest as civilian crew, a standard precaution Chen had insisted on for exactly this scenario, went dark, dropped into the freighter's maintenance crawlways, and waited. Voss's men herded the visible passengers to the cargo deck. They did not find the other 4. They did not think to look because raiding was, for the compact, a business built on speed and intimidation rather than thoroughness, and speed and intimidation had never failed them before. Chen watched through a maintenance grate as Voss put his boot on a hostage's neck and opened a channel to the reckoning. He recognized the type immediately. The performative cruelty, the countdown, the theater of it. Men like Voss had learned violence as a language of leverage, a way to make other people move. What Voss had never learned, because no one had ever survived long enough to teach him, was what happened when the people on the other end of that leverage had already decided the countdown didn't apply to them. Chen keyed his own short-range channel, the one that fed straight to Reyes's command chair. 4 words carrying a lifetime of certainty. "Ma'am, we're in position." Reyes's answer took less than a second. "Copy, Gunny. On my mark." Beside him in the crawlway, Priya Okonkwo checked her weapon for the 3rd time in as many minutes. Not out of nerves, but out of the same ritual discipline that had gotten her through her first deployment alive, when 3 other recruits in her graduating class hadn't made it home. She'd transferred to the Reckoning 11 months earlier from a border patrol unit that had never once seen real combat, and the 2 Marines flanking her, a broad, quiet man named Thomas Idowu and a sharp-eyed sniper named Yuki Halverson, had spent those 11 months teaching her the difference between training and instinct, the specific muscle memory that let a person move through a crisis, without the crisis ever quite catching up to their thinking. "You good?" Chen asked her, low, without turning his head. "I'm good, Gunny." She meant it. That was the part that had surprised her most about serving under Chen, not the drills, which were relentless, but the way he'd built a squad that walked into a hostage situation with genuine calm instead of the brittle, performed confidence she'd seen from other units. Chen didn't demand fearlessness. He demanded preparation, and he'd found, over a career of watching fear eat other units alive, that preparation was the only thing that actually produced it. Through the grate, Chen watched Voss press his boot harder against the kneeling woman's neck, saw her flinch, saw the raider beside Voss laugh at something Chen's translator hadn't caught. He filed it away with the same flat, patient attention he brought to everything else. Not anger, not yet, just information. Another data point in a picture he'd been building since the moment the Corvette grappled the Halcyon Vow's hull. He'd learned a long time ago on his first deployment that anger was a luxury a boarding team couldn't afford in the moment. It came later, if it came at all, in the quiet hours after an operation when the adrenaline burned off and left something colder and more permanent behind. Right now there was only the plan, and the plan required 6 more seconds of watching a man he was about to stop believe he still had control of the room. 30 seconds, Voss's voice crackled through the deck above them, carrying down through the ventilation shaft with the particular, theatrical cruelty of a man performing for an audience he assumed would flinch. Let's see what a Death Worlder does with 30 seconds. Chen keyed his comm one final time, 4 words that would, within days, become the single most replayed line in every after-action briefing the Colonial Navy circulated that year. "Ma'am, we're in position." The mark when it came arrived as a silence rather than a sound. Every light aboard the Raider Corvette died in the same half-second. The Reckoning's railgun round tore through its main power trunk. A shot fired not at the hull's thickest armor, but at a single conduit junction that Reyes's tactical officer had identified through 6 hours of passive scanning during the approach, back when the convoy still looked, to the compact's sensors, like an easy target moving on schedule. It was the kind of shot that required knowing exactly where to look before you needed to look there. It was the kind of shot the compact's intelligence had never imagined a human crew capable of planning, because their intelligence still measured humans by the diplomats who'd shaken their governor's hands and the trade envoys who'd apologized for the inconvenience of existing in contested space. Voss's threat board didn't register the round as an attack. It registered it as a malfunction, because his sensors had logged the Reckoning's weapons as passive not 4 seconds earlier, and Voss's whole strategy depended on a species that hesitated when the muzzle was already at a hostage's head. He was still processing the sudden dark when Chen's voice came over his own frequency, and the airlock that should have taken 30 seconds to cycle, that his own boarding crew had cycled in 30 seconds not 20 minutes before, opened in 6. Marcus Chen did not come through that airlock like a man storming a room. He came through it like a man finishing a sentence he'd started hours ago. Behind him, 3 Marines fanned into the cargo deck's side corridors with the unhurried economy of people who had rehearsed this exact geometry and simulation so many times that the real thing felt almost slow by comparison. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic entrance. There was a raider reaching for his weapon, and then there was a raider on the deck, and the 11 seconds Voss thought he had left collapsed into 4, and in the 4th second Voss found the muzzle of his own sidearm no longer pressed to a hostage's skull, because Chen's hand had closed over the weapon and turned it aside with the same economy of motion he'd used to redirect a door. "I told you," Chen said, and his voice was still that same unhurried, almost gentle register. "You had about 11 seconds. You used them arguing with a woman who wasn't listening." What followed was not a fight so much as a demonstration. The compact raiders aboard the Halcyon Vow had trained for intimidation, for crowd control, for the specific choreography of making frightened civilians comply. They had not trained for 4 Marines who had spent the last 6 months running boarding drills against exactly this raider unit's known tactics, because Chen had pulled the compact's operational patterns from 3 prior incident reports and drilled his squad against them until the drills stopped feeling like drills. 2 raiders went down before they cleared their holsters. A third made it 3 steps toward the aft corridor, before a Marine named Priya Okonkwo put him on the deck with a strike that would earn her a joke for weeks afterward about efficiency ratings. Voss himself, disarmed and pinned, found himself staring up at Chen's face and searching it for the fear he expected, the hesitation, the sentimental flicker that every briefing had promised him would be there. He found none of it. What he found instead was something closer to patience, the specific, terrible patience of a man who had done this exact job on the perimeter, against exactly this kind of predator, more times than he cared to count, and had stopped being surprised by any of it a long time ago. "Here's what's going to happen," Chen told him, kneeling so Voss could hear him clearly over the sound of his own men being disarmed around them. "You're going to tell me everything about your fleet's position, your command structure, and every convoy you've hit in the last year. And you're going to do it because it's the only thing you have left to trade, since your ship out there just lost main power and your captain out there." Chen tipped his head toward the viewport, where the raider corvette hung dark against the stars. "Just found out our warship wasn't paralyzed. It was patient. Those aren't the same thing, and nobody ever taught you the difference." Aboard the Reckoning, Captain Reyes watched the tactical display resolve in real time. The corvette dead in space, Chen's squad in full control of the Halcyon Vow's cargo deck, all 41 hostages accounted for, and unharmed. She allowed herself exactly 1 breath of relief before her sensor officer's voice cut through it. "Captain, we've got 3 more contacts. They were running silent behind the debris field. They're moving to intercept." Reyes's jaw tightened, but nothing else about her changed. She had run this simulation too. "Copy. Set condition 1 throughout the ship. Signal the convoy to scatter to rally Point Bravo." She looked at her XO, a broad-shouldered lieutenant commander named Ayanna Marsh, who'd flown with Reyes for 6 years and had learned to read her captain's silences the way other officers read orders. They committed their whole strike group to this. That corvette wasn't the play. It was the bait. For what? Reyes's eyes never left the display. For us to relax. She keyed the shipwide comm, and her voice carried through every corridor of the Reckoning with the same flat, unhurried certainty Chen had used on Voss 30 seconds earlier. Because that certainty wasn't a performance either of them put on. It was simply what happened to a person's voice after enough years of meaning exactly what they said. "All hands, this is the captain. The Ashari Compact just found out that threatening this crew doesn't buy them what they think it buys them. They've got 3 more ships inbound to make sure the lesson doesn't stick. We're going to make sure it does. Battle stations." In the cargo deck of the Halcyon Vow, the freed hostages heard the same announcement relayed through Chen's people, and for the first time since the raiders had grappled their hull, something other than fear moved through the room. An older man near the front, a retired shipping executive named Walter Osei, who'd spent the boarding convinced he was going to die on his way to visit a granddaughter he'd never met, found himself watching the 4 Marines around him with something close to awe, the specific, disorienting relief of a civilian discovering that the abstract idea of military protection had a face, 4 faces, and none of them had so much as raised their voice. "You knew this was coming," he said to Okonkwo, who was running a final check on the last raiders' restraints. The whole time, you knew they'd come back with more ships. We assumed it, Okonkwo said, not unkindly. Assuming's free. Planning for it is the part that matters. She nodded toward the viewport where the reckoning was already coming about, her drive flaring bright against the dark. You're not going to want to watch what happens next, sir. But you're safe. That part's done. Osi believed her, and would tell the story for the rest of his life exactly the way it had happened. Not as a rescue, which implied luck, but as the specific, deliberate unfolding of a plan 4 people had already finished in their heads before the shooting started. Commander Ithrain Voss had not planned to lose the Halcyon Vows boarding party. He had planned even less to be the reason a compact strike commander 3 systems away made a decision that would end with his entire operational network erased from the Kesset expanse inside 72 hours. But that decision was already in motion before Voss's corvette went dark, because the raiders' true commander, a woman named Kalis Thorne, who ran the compact's frontier operations from a command carrier called the Vengeful Tithe, had built her entire 6-year career on a single, carefully cultivated piece of galactic folklore. Humans didn't fight back. Not really. Not the way species with proper military traditions fought back. They negotiated, they postured, they filed grievances with regional councils that took months to convene and years to rule. Thorne had read the reports. She had watched the recordings of human diplomats apologizing for boundary disputes that weren't their fault. She had built her raiding schedule around the assumption that a human warship, faced with hostages, would do exactly what every other species in the quadrant did: freeze, negotiate, and eventually pay. What Thorne had not accounted for, what almost nothing in her intelligence files accounted for because the intelligence had been gathered from human diplomatic channels and not from human military doctrine, was the specific, deliberate distance humanity kept between the two. Earth's governments had spent the first 50 years of interstellar contact building an image of patient, rules-bound cooperation, because a young species with no allies and no reputation needed the wider galaxy to believe it wasn't a threat. That image was not a lie exactly. It was a mask, worn by the diplomats, over a species whose entire evolutionary and historical record was a 400,000-year argument about how far it would go to protect its own. The colonial navy did not advertise that argument. It didn't need to. It simply staffed its warships with the people who had already answered it. Thorne's mistake, compounding on Voss's, was ordering her 3 remaining strike ships to close on the Reckoning's position the instant Voss's corvette went dark, operating on the theory that overwhelming numbers would force the human captain back into the negotiating posture the Compact had always relied on. It was a reasonable theory, built on reasonable data, and it was about to fail in a way that would be studied by Compact tacticians for the rest of the organization's rapidly shortening lifespan. Aboard the Reckoning, Captain Reyes watched the 3 raider ships close formation on her tactical display and felt something settle in her chest that wasn't quite anticipation and wasn't quite anger, something closer to the specific, cold clarity that came from watching an opponent walk exactly into the shape of a plan you'd already built for them. "Talk to me, Marsh," she said. Her XO didn't look up from the tactical station. 2 corvettes, 1 light cruiser, coming in a standard pincer. They're going to try to flank us while we're covering the convoy's scatter. Marsh's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. They think we're going to stay defensive because we've got the hostages back and nothing left to prove. They think wrong. Reyes had spent 11 years learning the specific arithmetic of convoy defense, and the first rule of that arithmetic was one that took most captains years to internalize, and some captains never learned at all. A warship that only reacts is a warship that eventually loses, because reaction ceded the initiative to whoever chose to attack first. The Reckoning was not going to react. She was going to finish what Voss had started, and she was going to do it before Thorne's strike group closed to a range where their numbers could matter. "Helm, bring us around to intercept heading, best speed. Weapons, I want firing solutions on the lead corvette's engine block and the cruiser's shield generator in that order. Gunnery Sergeant Chen," she keyed the shipwide again, "get your people and the hostages secured and get that corvette's data core pulled. I want everything on their network before we're done here." "Copy, Captain." Chen's voice came back, steady as ever, already moving. "Give us 10 minutes. You've got 6. The reckoning came about with a smoothness that belied the violence of what was coming, her drive flaring bright against the amber haze of the expanse as she abandoned the defensive posture Thorne's strike group had been counting on, and turned instead to meet them. It was a small thing tactically, a warship choosing to close distance rather than hold position, but it represented the entire gap between what the compact believed about humanity and what humanity actually was, and that gap was about to close at closing speed. Thorne, watching the human warship's vector change on her own display 3 systems away, felt the first genuine flicker of doubt she'd allowed herself in 6 years of raiding. It passed almost as quickly as it arrived, buried under the weight of 6 years of profitable assumptions. She keyed her strike commander's channel and gave the order to press the attack anyway, because the alternative, admitting that everything her operation had been built on might be wrong, was not a thought she had room for yet. She would have room for it soon. By then, it would already be too late to matter. Thorne's second-in-command, a scarred veteran named Drake, who had served with her since the compact's earliest raids, watched her give the order and hesitated in a way he rarely allowed himself around her. "Commander," he said carefully, "Voss's Corvette went dark in under 30 seconds. That's not a lucky shot. That's a targeting solution somebody built before the shooting started." Thorne's jaw tightened, but her voice stayed level. The voice of a commander who had built 6 years of profit on never showing doubt in front of her own crew. "One human captain with a good gunner doesn't change 6 years of data, Drake. Every raid we've run against these people, they've talked first and fought last. Press the attack. And if this one's different, then we'll learn that the hard way, same as everyone learns anything the hard way out here." Thorne closed the channel before Drake could press further, because she had built her entire career on the specific stubborn refusal to let a single data point overturn a pattern that had made her rich for 6 years running. And patterns, she had always believed, were more reliable than any individual moment of bad luck. It was, in the end, the same mistake Voss had made. The same mistake the wider galaxy kept making about a species it had decided based on the diplomats it met first, that it already understood completely. Thorne would have the rest of her life, considerably shorter than she expected as it turned out, to reconsider that belief. The engagement that followed would later be taught at 3 separate colonial Navy training academies as a textbook example of decisive small unit warfare, though none of the instructors who taught it ever quite managed to convey in a lecture hall what it had actually felt like aboard the Reckoning in those 6 minutes. The particular focused calm of a crew that had drilled for this exact scenario so many times that the real thing arrived not as chaos, but as a kind of grim, practiced rhythm. The lead compact corvette broke from the pincer formation first, accelerating hard to close the gap before the Reckoning's heavier weapons could bring their full arc to bear, a reasonable tactic against a slower, more cautious opponent. The Reckoning was neither. Her railgun crew, a team of 4 led by a weapons chief named Dario Alves, who had spent 9 years perfecting a discipline most navies didn't bother teaching anymore, tracked the Corvette's engine block through its evasive burn and put a round through it with a margin of error smaller than the ship's own hull tolerances. The Corvette didn't explode. It simply stopped, its drive section a ruin of slagged conduit, tumbling out of the engagement in a slow, humiliating spiral that its remaining crew would spend the next several hours trying and failing to arrest. "One down," Marsh reported, and there was no triumph in her voice, only the clean satisfaction of a plan executing exactly as designed. "Cruisers bringing shields up. Second corvettes trying to flank to our starboard." "Let them," Reyes said. "Helm, hold heading, weapons, cruisers, shield generator the moment they're committed." The Ashari cruiser, the Vengeful Tide's sister ship, a vessel called the Righteous Debt that had, in 6 years of raiding, never once faced an opponent who fired first, brought its shields up in the expectation of a prolonged exchange, the kind of grinding, attritional fight the compact's doctrine was built around. Wear down a target's defenses, force a surrender, take the prize intact. It was a doctrine built for opponents who fought like the compact fought. The Reckoning did not. Alves's second shot came less than 90 seconds after the first, threading a gap in the Righteous Debt's shield envelope that existed for less than 2 seconds while the cruiser's own weapons cycled. a gap that Reyes's tactical computer had identified and flagged before the shot was even called, because the Reckoning's targeting officer, a quiet ensign named Bishop Okafor, who rarely spoke above a murmur, had spent his off-duty hours for the last 4 months building a library of compact shield cycling patterns from every prior engagement report the Colonial Navy had on file. It was not glamorous work. It had just won them a battle. The shield generator took the round and failed catastrophically, venting plasma along the cruiser's dorsal hull in a bright, ugly bloom that the Righteous Dett's crew would later describe, in the one interrogation transcript that survived, as the moment they understood they had made a mistake they weren't going to get to correct. The second corvette, flanking to starboard exactly as Reyes had predicted, ran directly into the Reckoning's secondary battery, a spread of point defense cannons that had spent the entire engagement quietly tracking a firing solution nobody on the Raiders' threat board had flagged as a threat, because point defense weapons weren't supposed to be able to punch through a corvette's flank armor at that range. The Reckonings were. Reyes had specifically requisitioned the upgrade 8 months earlier, over budget objections from Fleet Logistics because she did not believe in a warship that couldn't hurt something up close. Weapons Chief Dario Alves had not raised his voice once during the entire 6 minutes, a fact that Ensign Okafor would mention, half in admiration and half in disbelief, to every new transfer who joined the Reckoning's gunnery crew for the next 2 years. Alves had learned his trade the hard way, aboard a mining survey vessel that had been caught unarmed in a pirate raid during his first year in the merchant service, an experience he rarely discussed but which had driven him, afterward, to a level of discipline and weapons handling that bordered on the monastic. He did not believe in wasted shots. He believed, with the specific conviction of a man who had once watched an unarmed crew die because no one aboard their ship had known how to fight back, that every round fired should end an engagement faster, not merely damage an opponent enough to prolong it. Second corvette's flank armor breached, he reported, voice as level as it had been at the start of the exchange. She's venting atmosphere, no further threat. Reyes watched the tactical display resolve, the 3 raider vessels reduced in 6 minutes from an active pincer to a tumbling wreck, a crippled hulk, and a fleeing cruiser, and felt the particular, hard-earned satisfaction of a plan that had cost her crew nothing more than a handful of shield hits and a few tense minutes of silence on the bridge. It was not triumph exactly. Reyes had never much cared for triumph. It tended to make officers sloppy on their next engagement. It was closer to confirmation, the specific, quiet relief of watching a doctrine she'd spent 11 years refining hold up exactly as designed, against an enemy who had never bothered to update his assumptions about what a human warship would do when the shooting started. 3 ships, 6 minutes. When it was over, the Righteous Dett limped away trailing atmosphere and plasma, her captain broadcasting an emergency withdrawal on every frequency the compact used, and the 2 corvettes that had flanked the Reckoning were dead in space, their crews facing a choice between surrender and a slow death in a system with no rescue coming. The surrendering crews would later describe the engagement, in interrogation transcripts that made their way into 3 separate Colonial Navy tactical journals, with a specific, bewildered consistency. The human warship had never once behaved like a target. It had behaved from the opening exchange like a predator that had simply chosen to let them believe otherwise for exactly as long as that belief was useful. Aboard the Halcyon Vow, Marcus Chen finished pulling the last of the corvette's data core with 40 seconds to spare on his own deadline, and looked up through the freighter's viewport just in time to watch the Righteous Dett break off and run. "Captain," he said into his comm, watching the cruiser's retreating drive flare fade into the dark. "You want us to pursue?" There was a pause on the other end. Not hesitation, but calculation. The specific quiet of a commanding officer weighing a decision that mattered more than the battle that had just ended. "No," Reyes said finally. "Let them run. I want them to get home and tell every raider in this quadrant exactly what happened here. That's worth more than 1 more ship." She was not wrong, but she had also, without quite meaning to, just made a decision that would draw the attention of someone far more dangerous than Kalis Thorne, because the Righteous Dett's emergency broadcast, meant only for compact ears, was intercepted 3 hours later by a listening post belonging to the 1 power in the quadrant that had been waiting, for longer than anyone aboard the Reckoning knew, for an excuse to test humanity properly. The listening post that intercepted the Righteous Debt's panicked broadcast belonged to a power the Ashari Compact paid tribute to and feared in equal measure. The Kurath Ascendancy, a militarized confederation that had spent 2 centuries conquering its way across the outer arm of the quadrant and had watched humanity's arrival with the specific, patient interest of a predator that had not yet decided whether a new animal in its territory was prey or competition. The Ascendancy did not raid convoys. It did not need to. It took tribute, and it enforced that tribute with a navy 3 times the size of anything the colonial fleet had yet deployed this far from Earth, and it had spent the 18 months since first contact with humanity running a quiet, methodical assessment of exactly how much resistance a human world would offer if the Ascendancy decided humanity's territory was worth annexing. The report on the Reckoning's engagement reached Grand Marshal Dresh Kaval within the hour, and Kaval read it twice, the second time more slowly than the first, because the numbers did not match anything in his species' extensive intelligence archive on the new arrivals. A single warship, lightly crewed relative to Ascendancy standards, had disabled 3 raider vessels in 6 minutes without taking a single casualty, using a combination of tactical patience, weapons discipline, and small unit boarding action that Kaval's own naval academy would have been proud to claim as doctrine. Kaval had built his entire career on a simple, brutal principle: test everything once before you commit to it fully. He had tested 17 species that way before folding their territories into the Ascendancy. 16 of them had confirmed his intelligence estimates on the first test. The 17th had cost him a fleet, and he had learned from that expensive lesson never to trust an intelligence estimate he hadn't personally stress-tested. The 17th species had been the Thriel Assembly's neighbors, a quiet agrarian people called the Doruun, whose entire diplomatic posture had suggested, to every Ascendancy analyst who studied them, a species that would fold at the first show of force. Kaval had believed that estimate completely, right up until a Doruun defense fleet he hadn't known existed emerged from a hidden shipyard and cost him 11 vessels in a single afternoon. He had rebuilt his career from that failure, through a discipline that had since become legend across the Ascendancy's officer corps. He stopped trusting reports written by people who had never personally stood in a room with the species being assessed, and he started sending someone he trusted to look for himself every time, no matter how confident the paperwork sounded. That discipline was the only reason humanity's estimate crossed his desk for a second look at all. A junior analyst, new enough to the directorate to still ask uncomfortable questions in briefings, had noted a strange inconsistency buried in 18 months of otherwise reassuring data. Human diplomatic behavior showed remarkable, almost engineered consistency across dozens of separate contact events. The kind of consistency that suggested not natural temperament, but deliberate policy. Kaval had filed the note away without acting on it, the way 100 small inconsistencies got filed away in any large intelligence directorate. The Reckoning's engagement was the first piece of evidence in 18 months that made him go back and read it again. Humanity's estimate, built on diplomatic behavior and extrapolated into military assumptions the way the compacts had been, now looked, in the light of the Reckoning's engagement, like exactly the kind of estimate that had cost him a fleet before. So Kaval decided to test it properly, not with a raiding party, with a warship of his own, the Ascendant Judgment, a heavy cruiser 3 times the Reckoning's mass, crewed by veterans of 7 annexation campaigns, and commanded by a captain named Vashithara, who had never lost an engagement and did not intend to start against a species barely a century removed from its own homeworld. The order Kaval gave was simple and, in its own way, honest. Proceed to the Kesset Expanse, engage the human warship directly, and report back exactly what happened. Not a raid, not an ambush. A test, conducted openly, by a power that had never needed to hide its strength before and saw no reason to start now. Aboard the Reckoning, Reyes received the Ascendancy's formal notice of intent to engage, because the Ascendancy, unlike the Compact, believed in the specific courtesy of announcing its tests in advance, the better to make the outcome unambiguous, with an expression that Marsh would later describe as the closest she'd ever seen her captain come to genuine excitement. "They want to know what we are," Reyes said, reading the notice a second time. They've been watching us for 18 months and they still don't know. That's a heavy cruiser, Captain, Marsh said carefully. 3 times our mass, full veteran crew. I know what it is. Reyes set the notice down and looked at her XO with the same flat, unhurried certainty she'd used on Voss's frequency 4 days earlier. I also know what we are. Signal Fleet Command. Tell them the Ascendancy wants a demonstration, and tell them we're going to give them one worth remembering. Marcus Chen, standing at the back of the bridge with the data core he'd pulled from Voss's Corvette still in hand, allowed himself something that wasn't quite a smile either. The specific, tired satisfaction of a man who had spent a career watching people underestimate exactly what a human crew, cornered and certain, was capable of. "Ma'am," he said, "permission to get my Marines ready. If this goes the way I think it's going to go, they're not going to want to stay at range." Reyes looked at him for a long moment, and something passed between them that didn't need words. The shared quiet understanding of 2 people who had both, in their own ways, spent their careers proving the same point to a galaxy that kept needing it proven. "Permission granted, Gunny," she said. "Let's show them." The 3 days between the Ascendancy's formal notice and the Ascendant Judgment's arrival gave the Reckoning time to do something few warships ever got before a fight they knew was coming. Prepare on their own terms. Reyes used every hour of it. She pulled the convoy back to a secured rally point 2 systems away, out of any possible blast radius, and requested, over the strenuous objection of a fleet logistics officer who did not understand why a single engagement in a system nobody in Colonial Command had heard of 18 months ago, warranted the resource allocation. A full sensor and weapons diagnostic from the nearest Colonial supply depot, along with something else. Something Reyes did not explain in her official request beyond the phrase, contingency staging, because she did not yet know if she would need it and did not want to raise expectations she might not be able to meet. What she was actually doing was calling in a favor 6 years old, from a fleet admiral named Torres Cade, who had served under her as a lieutenant during the perimeter campaigns, and who owed Elena Reyes, by his own private accounting, considerably more than a favor. Cade commanded the 3rd Frontier Battle Group, currently on a routine patrol circuit 4 days hard burn from the Kesset Expanse, close enough, if the timing worked, to matter, and far enough that no Ascendancy sensor sweep would flag it as a threat, until it was already too late to matter to anyone but the Ascendancy. Reyes did not tell her own crew about the message to Cade. She did not want them fighting a battle they thought they might not have to finish alone. She wanted them to fight it the way they'd fought Voss and Thorn, like the outcome was never in doubt, because doubt was the one weapon the Reckoning could not afford to hand an enemy who was already 3 times her mass. Marcus Chen spent the 3 days running his Marines through boarding drills against a mocked-up deck plan of an Ascendancy heavy cruiser, built from the sparse intelligence the Colonial Navy had managed to gather in 18 months of cautious first contact. It was incomplete, educated guesswork stitched together from trade attaché reports and the handful of scans Colonial diplomatic vessels had managed to collect during formal visits. Chen ran the drills anyway, because incomplete intelligence drilled against relentlessly still beat no preparation at all, and because he had learned a long time ago on the perimeter that the crews who survived the worst days were never the ones who waited for perfect information. "They're going to expect us to hold position and trade fire," he told his squad on the 2nd night, standing in front of the mocked-up deck plan with a stylus in hand, marking likely choke points with the same patient economy he brought to everything else. That's how their doctrine works. Overwhelming mass, grinding exchange, force the smaller ship to break first. We're not going to give them that fight. Captain Reyes is going to get us in close, and when we're in close, that's when this becomes our fight instead of theirs. Priya Okonkwo, cleaning her sidearm with the methodical care of someone who found the ritual calming, glanced up. "You really think a heavy cruiser's going to let a Corvette-weight warship get in close, Gunny?" Chen's mouth curved, the closest thing to humor he allowed himself before a fight. "I think Captain Vashathara has read the same intelligence reports the Ascendancy always reads about us. I think he believes we're going to hold at range and hope for the best, same as everybody else has believed right up until they stopped believing it." He tapped the deck plan, right at the cruiser's forward hangar bay. "He's about to learn what the rest of them learned. We don't hope, we plan." The Ascendant Judgment dropped out of transit on the 4th day, precisely on schedule, precisely as its formal notice had promised. Because the Ascendancy did not believe in the specific dishonesty of an ambush, when a direct test would serve its purposes just as well and prove considerably more. Captain Vosh Ithera opened a hailing channel the moment his cruiser's sensors confirmed the Reckoning's position, and his voice when it came through carried the particular, weary confidence of a veteran of 7 campaigns who had never once needed to raise it. Human vessel. This is Captain Vosh Ithera of the Ascendancy cruiser Ascendant Judgment. Grand Marshal Kaval has authorized a direct assessment of your species' military capability. This is not an act of war. It is a test conducted openly, and I extend you the courtesy of an honest fight, rather than the ambush your compact attackers favored. I would ask the same courtesy in return. On the Reckoning's bridge, Reyes keyed her own channel, and her voice carried across the gap between the 2 ships with the same flat, unhurried certainty that had, 4 days earlier, told Ithrain Voss exactly how much time he had left. Captain Ithera. This is Captain Elena Reyes, UCS Reckoning. I appreciate the courtesy and I'll return it. My crew isn't interested in proving a point about honor. We're interested in proving a point about consequences. Your Grand Marshal wants to know what happens when someone threatens a human warship's crew. You're about to find out firsthand instead of reading it in a report. There was a pause on Ithara's end, not hesitation but the specific recalibration of a veteran officer registering, for the first time, that the confidence in the human captain's voice was not bravado. It was the same flat certainty every Ascendancy intelligence report had failed, somehow to capture. Then let us begin, Ithera said, and closed the channel. The Ascendant Judgment opened the engagement the way Ascendancy doctrine always opened engagements against a smaller opponent, with overwhelming, methodical firepower, delivered at maximum range, designed to force a weaker ship into a defensive crouch it would never climb out of. Her forward batteries lit the dark between the 2 ships in a spread of plasma fire that would have vaporized a lesser vessel's shields in the first exchange. The Reckoning was not where the Ascendant Judgment's targeting solution expected her to be. Reyes had ordered evasive maneuvers the instant Ithera's channel closed. Not the panicked scattering of a ship trying to survive, but the precise, drilled choreography of a crew that had spent 3 days running exactly this scenario in simulation against every fragment of Ascendancy tactical doctrine the Colonial Navy's Intelligence Division could provide. The Reckoning slipped inside the plasma spread's outer envelope, absorbing a glancing hit along her portside shielding that dropped power to 40%, but left her weapons, her drive, and her boarding tubes fully intact. "Shields holding," Marsh called out, voice tight but controlled. "They're recalibrating for a second volley. They won't get the chance." Reyes's eyes were locked on the tactical display, watching the gap between the 2 ships close at a rate that made Ithara's bridge crew, 600 kilometers away, begin, for the first time in the engagement, to understand what Chen had predicted 3 days earlier in a marine berthing compartment. Nobody aboard the Ascendant Judgment had any way of knowing about. "Helm, hold this heading. Weapons, target their forward point defense grid. I want it blind before we're in boarding range." Bishop Okafor's quiet voice carried the same certainty it always did. "Solution locked, Captain." The Reckoning's railgun found the Ascendant Judgment's point defense grid with the same surgical precision that had taken out Voss's power trunk and the Righteous Debt's shield generator 4 days earlier. And for the first time in Vosh Ithara's 7 campaigns, his bridge crew watched a ship a third their mass close to knife-fighting range, while his own weapons, built and drilled for exactly the kind of long-range grinding exchange his doctrine favored, found themselves unable to track a target that had simply refused to stay at the distance where those weapons worked best. "They're closing," Ithara's tactical officer reported, disbelief cutting through Ascendancy discipline for just a moment. "Sir, they're inside our minimum engagement envelope." Ithara had commanded 7 campaigns without once needing to adjust his doctrine mid-engagement. He adjusted it now, ordering point defense to close-range mode and his boarding parties to combat stations, a reasonable, well-drilled response from a captain who still, even now, believed this was a test of mass and firepower, rather than a test of exactly what kind of fight the Reckoning's crew had spent a career learning to win. He would understand the difference in the next 4 minutes, and he would understand it the same way every opponent in this story had understood it. Too late to change the outcome, in time only to understand why it had happened. The reckoning came alongside the Ascendant Judgment's flank at a range Ithra's doctrine had never trained for, close enough that both ships' point defense grids struggled to find targeting solutions without risking their own hull. And in that narrow, chaotic window, Captain Elena Reyes gave the order Marcus Chen had been waiting 3 days to hear. "Gunny, you're clear. Take their forward hangar." Chen's boarding party launched from the Reckoning's starboard tubes in 4 hardened assault pods, crossing the gap between the two ships in the specific, controlled silence of Marines who had run this exact profile so many times in simulation that the real thing arrived not as fear but as familiar rhythm. The pod struck the Ascendant Judgment's forward hangar bay doors with a coordinated breach that blew the outer seal in a spray of atmosphere and debris, and Chen was through the gap before the alarm klaxons aboard the cruiser had finished their first cycle. What followed inside the Ascendant Judgment was, by any ascendancy standard, an impossibility. Ithera's Marines outnumbered Chen's boarding party 6-1, veterans of 7 campaigns against a squad that had, until 8 days ago, spent most of its career on convoy escort duty in a quiet stretch of contested space nobody in the ascendancy had thought worth watching closely. The numbers said the boarding party should have been stopped at the hangar bay, contained, and eventually overwhelmed. The numbers did not account for what Chen had spent 3 days drilling into his squad, or what he'd spent a career learning on the perimeter, in fights that never made it into any official record, because the colonial navy hadn't existed yet in any form the wider galaxy recognized when he'd first learned it. That a smaller force, moving with absolute certainty through terrain it had memorized down to the meter, could turn a numerical disadvantage into an ambush of its own. Chen split his 4-person team into 2 pairs the instant they cleared the hangar bay, exactly as drilled, each pair taking a separate route toward the cruiser's engineering deck, not to destroy it, but to seize the one thing that mattered more than any weapon aboard the ship, the Ascendant Judgment's central data core, which held not just Ithara's operational logs, but the Ascendancy's entire assessment framework for humanity, the accumulated 18 months of observation that had led Grand Marshal Caval to authorize this test in the first place. Chen took the port route himself, paired with Yuki Halverson, whose sniper training made her better suited than most to the tight, unpredictable geometry of an unfamiliar warship's corridors, where a fight could open up from any angle and close again just as fast. They moved with the same unhurried economy that had carried them through the Halcyon Vow's cargo deck 8 days earlier. And Chen found himself, in the strange, compressed quiet between engagements, thinking about the first hostage situation of his career, the one he never talked about, the one that had taught him at 22, exactly what happened to a boarding team that hesitated a half-second too long waiting for permission that never came in time. He'd lost 2 people that day. He had spent every year since making certain he never lost anyone again to hesitation, and the drills he ran, the plans he built, the relentless, almost obsessive preparation he demanded of every Marine under his command, all of it traced back to a corridor very much like this one, on a ship he no longer let himself picture clearly, where he had learned the one lesson that mattered more than any tactic. Certainty, built in advance, was the only thing that reliably beat fear in the moment it counted. Halvorsen caught the first Ascendancy patrol before they'd cleared the second junction, dropping 2 guards with the same clean economy Okonkwo had shown on the starboard route, and Chen keyed his short-range comm to confirm status with the rest of his split team without breaking stride. Idowu, Okonkwo, report. Starboard route clear. Okonkwo's voice came back, steady despite the sound of a distant alarm klaxon cycling somewhere behind her. Data cores 2 junctions ahead. Contact resistance light. Copy. Converge on my position once you've got it. Chen pressed forward, Halverson a half-step behind him, both of them moving through a ship 3 times the Reckoning's mass with the specific, disorienting confidence of people who had memorized a deck plan built from incomplete intelligence, and trusted their own preparation to fill the gaps their intelligence couldn't. It was not recklessness. It was the particular, hard-won faith of professionals who had tested that preparation against worse odds than this one, more times than either of them cared to count and had never yet found it wanting. They reached the data core 2 minutes later, exactly as planned, exactly as drilled. And Chen pulled the core's physical housing free of its mounting with the same unhurried care he'd have used disarming a hostage situation, because a rushed extraction risked corrupting exactly the information Reyes needed most. Priya Okonkwo took point on the starboard route, moving through corridors built for a species half again humanity's average height, with the same unhurried confidence she'd shown aboard the Halcyon Vow 8 days earlier. And when an Ascendancy security detail rounded a corner ahead of her, she did not hesitate the way their doctrine expected a human marine to hesitate. She had already decided, 3 days ago in a mocked-up corridor built from incomplete intelligence, exactly how this moment would go, and the security detail, trained for a grinding, attritional fight against an opponent who fought like they fought, had no answer for a marine who had already finished the fight in her head before it started in the corridor. Outside, the Reckoning and the Ascendant Judgment traded fire at a range that punished both ships, Reyes's crew absorbing hits to their shields that would have crippled a less disciplined vessel, while Alves's weapons crew found gap after gap in the cruiser's point defense coverage, each shot chipping away at a warship whose entire doctrine had never accounted for an opponent willing to trade its own comfort for a decisive close-range fight. It was in the 4th minute of the engagement, with Chen's boarding party seizing the Ascendant Judgment's data core, and Alves's crew finding the gap in the cruiser's dorsal shielding, that Bishop Okafor had been quietly cataloging since the fight began, that the second act of Elena Reyes's 3-day preparation arrived precisely on schedule. Fleet Admiral Torres Cade's 3rd Frontier Battle Group dropped out of transit at the edge of the Kesset Expanse. 4 warships, including a heavy cruiser of the Colonial Navy's own that matched the Ascendant Judgment mass for mass, arriving not as a rescue but as a demonstration of exactly the point Reyes had wanted to make from the moment Caval's formal notice arrived. Humanity did not send one warship to face a threat. It sent whatever it took, and it did not particularly care how long that took to arrange, because a species that had spent 400,000 years arguing about how far it would go to protect its own did not measure its resolve by the size of a single crew. Aboard the Ascendant Judgment, Captain Vash Ithara watched his tactical display resolve into a picture that no Ascendancy intelligence estimate had prepared him for. A single human warship that had already closed to knife-fighting range and seized his data core, backed now by a battle group that outmassed his own vessel, arriving with a precision timing that told him, more clearly than any weapons exchange could, that this had never been the improvised, desperate defense his doctrine assumed a smaller opponent would offer. It had been a plan, built days in advance, executed with a patience that matched anything in the Ascendancy's own 7-campaign veteran playbook. He opened a channel to Reyes with the specific, careful formality of an officer choosing his surrender terms with more caution than he had chosen anything else in his career. Captain Reyes, my data core is compromised, my point defense is failing, and your reinforcements have arrived faster than any estimate the Ascendancy possessed for your fleet's response capability in this quadrant. I am prepared to withdraw, if you will extend the same courtesy of an honest engagement that I extended you. Reyes considered the offer for exactly as long as it took to confirm, on her own tactical display, that Chen's boarding party had the data core secured, and every one of his Marines accounted for and unharmed. Captain Ithara, she said, you extended honesty. I'll extend the same. Withdraw your ship. Take this back to Grand Marshal Caval, word for word. Humanity isn't interested in your territory, your tribute, or your test results. But the next time anyone in the Ascendancy decides to threaten a human crew to see what happens, they should know exactly what happened here today, because we're not going to explain it twice. Ithara did not make the decision alone, though the final order was his to give. His executive officer, a veteran of 4 campaigns named Sael Vorik, who had served under him since his second command, watched the tactical display with the particular dawning clarity of an officer recalculating everything he thought he understood about the balance of power in the quadrant, and said the thing Ithara had been thinking, but had not yet allowed himself to voice. Sir, if this is what one human crew does with 3 days' warning, what does their whole colonial fleet look like with a year of it? Ithara did not answer immediately. He was watching Chen's boarding party's status feed, the 4 Marines who had gone into a warship 3 times the Reckoning's mass, against odds that should have ended the engagement in the Ascendancy's favor within the first 90 seconds, and had instead walked out with the one asset that mattered more than the whole exchange of fire around them. He thought of the 16 species Cavall had tested and folded successfully into the ascendancy, and the specific, uncomfortable arithmetic of how many of those species might have looked on paper, exactly as unthreatening as humanity had looked 18 months ago. "I don't know, Vorik," he said finally, "and I would very much prefer the ascendancy find out through negotiation rather than through another afternoon like this one." The Ascendant Judgment withdrew under her own power 4 minutes later, trailing atmosphere from a dozen breach points and carrying, in Vosh Ithra's own private assessment, the one he would file not to Cavall's formal intelligence directorate, but to the small trusted circle of officers who had served with him across all 7 campaigns, a warning far more valuable than any tribute the Ascendancy might have extracted from a conquered human world. Humanity was not a young, sentimental species playing at diplomacy while it grew into its strength. It was a species that had simply chosen, deliberately and with total consistency, to let the galaxy underestimate it for exactly as long as that underestimation remained useful, and no longer. The data Corps Chen's boarding party recovered told Grand Marshal Cavall everything he needed to know within the hour, and what it told him canceled, in a single afternoon, 18 months of careful annexation planning. Cavall did not send another test. He sent, instead, a formal diplomatic delegation, and the treaty that emerged from 6 weeks of subsequent negotiation would establish the Kesset Expanse as neutral trade space, patrolled jointly, with the Ashari Compact's operations in the region dismantled within the year by a coalition of colonial and ascendancy forces that had, until 8 days earlier, considered each other far more likely rivals than partners. The story of the Reckoning's engagement traveled the way every good warning travels among people who make their living reading the room correctly, quietly, quickly, and with far more accuracy than the official reports ever managed. Raiders who had never heard of the Kesset Expanse learned within a month the specific shorthand that would define human warships across the frontier for the next decade, that a human crew, threatened directly, did not calculate the cost of a fight. It had already decided, long before the threat arrived, exactly how far it would go, and the only variable left to determine was how quickly the other side would understand that. Kalis Thorne's compact network dissolved within the year, hunted to the last outpost by a joint task force that included, in a detail that made its way into more than one after-action report with a note of genuine irony, 4 Ascendancy officers who had personally requested the assignment after reading Vosh Ithara's private assessment. Ithrain Voss spent the rest of his life in a colonial detention facility, and the one interview he ever granted, to a journalist researching the collapse of frontier raiding operations across the quadrant, contained a single line that outlived every other part of the piece, quoted in academy lecture halls and tactical journals for years afterward. "I had 30 seconds. I spent them on the wrong assumption. Marcus Chen returned to convoy escort duty within the month, because that was the job, and because he had never much cared for the parts of this story that turned it into legend rather than a Tuesday." When a young recruit aboard the Reckoning's next posting asked him, with the specific nervous curiosity of someone who'd heard the story secondhand a dozen times, what it had actually felt like to breach that hangar bay against 6-to-1 odds, Chen considered the question with the same patient economy he brought to everything else. "It felt like Tuesday," he said. "We'd drilled it 100 times before it mattered once. That's the whole trick. By the time it's real, it shouldn't feel like anything new." Captain Elena Reyes was offered a promotion to a desk posting at Fleet Command within 6 months, on the strength of an engagement report that senior officers across 3 fleets had, by then, read more times than any tactical document in a decade. She turned it down, the same way she'd turned down 2 prior promotions because the desk job would have taken her off the Reckoning's bridge, and Elena Reyes had built a career on a simple, unglamorous principle that the whole quadrant had just watched, proven in 6 minutes and then again in 4. The crew that trains like the worst day is coming is the crew that never has to be surprised when it arrives. Far across the Ascendancy's territory, Grand Marshal Dresh Cavall kept a single line from the Ascendant Judgment's Data Corps recovery report pinned above his own command station for the rest of his career, not as a trophy, but as the specific, permanent reminder of the 17th test that had, this time, cost him nothing but a warship's pride instead of a fleet. It read, in the flat, unhurried transcript of Chen's voice from the boarding recording his own Marines hadn't known was still transmitting. You had about 11 seconds left. I'd use them to put the gun down. No one, across the whole width of the Kesset expanse and the systems beyond it, ever needed to be told twice again what happened when they threatened a human warship's crew. The lesson traveled on its own, carried by the raiders who survived long enough to spread it and by the ones who didn't, whose silence taught it just as clearly. Hayana Marsh stayed aboard the Reckoning another 4 years after the engagement, long enough to earn her own command, and long enough to run her own crew through the same relentless, unglamorous preparation she'd learned watching Reyes plan for a fight that hadn't happened yet. When a reporter asked her years later what she thought the single most important lesson of the Kesset Expanse engagement had been, she gave an answer that didn't make the headline, but outlived the ones that did. Everybody wants to talk about the 6 minutes or the 4 minutes aboard the Judgment, she said. Nobody wants to talk about the 3 days before it, or the 8 months of budget fights Captain Reyes won to get that point defense upgrade nobody thought we'd need. The fight isn't the story. The fight's just the part where all the boring preparation finally gets to matter. Walter Osei did meet his granddaughter, 3 weeks later than planned, and told her the story of the Halcyon vow so many times over the following years that she could recite Okonkwo's exact words from memory before she turned 10. Assuming's free, planning for it is the part that matters. A small second-hand piece of colonial marine doctrine that traveled, in its own quiet way, just as far as anything in the official after-action reports, and on a data slate in a colonial Navy archive, filed under an engagement report that would be studied for a generation, a young analyst preparing training materials for the next class of frontier officers wrote a single closing line that captured, better than any of the formal doctrine documents that followed, exactly what the Kesset Expanse had taught a wider galaxy that thought it already knew what humanity was. They mistook our patience for permission. We were never going to give them either one twice.